Hi, and welcome to the Improvisors podcast. I'm Kevin James, and this is my co-host, Neil Thomas.
Thank you, Kevin. On the Improvisers podcast, we talk with improvisers about their experience and practices of improvisation. Who are we talking with today, Kevin?
Neil, we've got the opportunity to be in conversation with Michael HAVIR. Michael spoke about the gift and opportunity of 1970s tertiary education, his many years spent living in the Northern Territory and travelling the world with Yothu Yindi.
Talked of the necessity of practice and training and scores in improvisation, the ultimate buzz of audience connection, the importance of silence in a piece of work, and working with Born in a Taxi. Good morning, Michael HAVIR. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Improvisers podcast.
Good morning to you. Good morning to you both.
Let's get straight into it, Michael.
Sure.
When did you run into improvisation, and how and when?
Improvisation for me really started back at music college when, or even before that, when I was studying music, when I started playing music, and I discovered, jazz, and well, I was into rock and all those things, and improvisation was a big part of those. So in music, that was where I first came across all that. And I was very lucky. I went to a college in Melbourne, which is now part of Melbourne University. It was Melbourne State College. And at that time, it was a very interesting time, actually, because the universities for the first time were opening up to mature age students and to people from backgrounds who would not normally have gone to university. So we had people who have just got out of prison. We had the entire Rocky Horror Show band there. We had middle-aged housewives who had sort of finished bringing up their kids and wanted to do something else, as well as, people who are straight out of school. And we also had some really kind of interesting lecturers there. Like we had Ron Nagorka, who is a contemporary Australian composer who studied didgeridoo, amongst other things, and Warren Burt. We had all these really interesting people there, as well as a lot of jazzers. And it was a really good time to be at university. It was a time when people lived on campus. They were there all day, every day, hanging out, playing, performing, socializing, going to lectures. It was a very vibrant time, and I'm afraid it really worries me when I go to universities now and I see what sort of sterile, kind of deserted places they are. Because students they're off trying to keep, they're trying to earn enough money to survive, keeping down 3 jobs, So that's where I first came across music improvisation. But then, of course, if we're talking about the sort of improvisation that you two have been involved in, it was really through who was it through? Anyway, I just remember getting involved in our Wonders classes in the when was that? It must have been the late 90s. And I did a few of those, not as a musician, but as just to sort of get a bit of a heads up on what it was involved and what it was about. So I did a few classes. Didn't do it for very long, did it for a little while. And then I got involved with Born in a Taxi, which was in about 2003, perhaps. And I'd seen their work before, and I really liked their work. I really liked the experimental nature of it. And when I heard that a lot of it was improvised, I was really fascinated, and so that's where I, found out more about their work, and then they asked me to do a piece with them in, around 2006, I think, or 2003. And we did a piece based on the Grimm fairy tales. And that was the first piece I did with them. And, you know, and then we continued to work together since then, really. So
most of the work that I've seen you do has been with Born in a Taxi within that context. But in reading your bio, I strongly suggest that those that are watching this read your bio, because it just speaks of the sort of breadth of background that you bring. I'd love to know more about what improvisation means for you now, after having been involved with Born in a Taxi for many years, as well as maybe other contexts where you work with sound improvisation. We've interviewed mostly movement-based improvisers, and I want to include you increasingly in that from having watched you perform of recent. But what does improvisation mean to you? What does it offer you, and what are you exploring as an improviser?
Okay, so originally I've really made a living for many years writing scores for, you know, that was what I wanted to do when I left college. I wanted to write film scores. And I started working with different groups I also started working in theatre as well. So I worked in theatre, and I also got involved in some film work. And then in it was a long time ago, I got a job with a dance company in Darwin as a musician in residence. And I went up to Darwin and lived there for, the dance company only lasted for a year before the funding got pulled. But that's when I first really started mucking around with improvising and working with physical performers. And after that, I decided to stay in Darwin. I ended up staying in Darwin for 6 years. And I ended up working with theatre companies up there, because it was quite a vibrant time there. There was a community arts centre up there. There was a youth theatre. There was a straight theatre company. And there was a lot of kind of guerrilla art going on, a lot of punk art. And I was sort of heavily involved in the scene up there, and I managed to make quite a good living from it, actually, because I was probably the only person in Darwin at the time who could do that sort of work, could come in and write a score for a sound design and a score and perform. I did quite a few things live as well, and so I got a lot of work there, which was great. It was really great. And so for several years, I worked up there. And at the same time, I also got involved in bands up there. So with white bands, quite a few of bands, but also with a lot of Indigenous performers. And through a friend of mine, I met the ex-drummer from the Village People who was living in Darwin. Is a drummer from New York, Alan Murphy. And we became friends. And through him, he got me involved in a group from Barunga, Beswick, called Black Balamujik. And we recorded a few albums together, and we did a lot of touring and gigs. And yeah, I have very fond memories of those times, playing Kirby's Back Bar in Catherine, and playing these really kind of wild venues, with cages and concrete, hose out sort of things. But great gigs we had. And then in the late, what time was it, about 89? I think, maybe 89. Just as Yothu Yindi started to really, at the time, it was Black Balamujik and Yothu Yindi were the two kind of bands that could, get somewhere at that time. But Black Bubble Music didn't, but Yothu Yindi did. And about the time they kind of hit the wave, they kind of hit just the beginning of the wave, the crest of the wave, I got asked to do some gigs with them. And that turned into a 2-year stint performing with them. And we toured the world, basically. Did tours of the US, and, Europe, UK, Japan, Papua New Guinea. We sort of went everywhere, really. It was a pretty exciting time. And this has been a bit of a feature of my work, is that I've moved between playing live music and writing scores and doing sound designs. Anyway, I left Darwin. I came back to Melbourne, which was a bit of a shock to the system. And I struggled here for quite a while. I managed to get back into sort of the film thing a bit and wrote some scores. But at that point, technology was a lot more basic than it is now. You really had to have a big mountain of gear. You couldn't really do much stuff live in performance, and much sort of sound stuff live. You had to have recorders and all sorts of things, a lot of technology. And I always wanted to get out of the studio. I really started to get tired of that thing of you sit at home in your studio, you get the film, you get you go to the rehearsal, you go home, you try and write some music, you go back, you try it out, you come back. And it was that sort of disconnect from the actual process of creation. And I really wanted to get out of the studio and actually be in, creating in the moment with the people there. But the technology wasn't really good enough. Laptops, you could get laptops powerful enough, but they were really expensive. And but gradually over time, the technology got better, and finally you could actually get gear and you could use it live. And so around sort of in the 2000s, I started, I started my first, experiments with using technology live in the studio and improvising and creating in the moment. And it was very liberating, and I became a bit hooked on it, really. And I really like it. And the reason I like it is because when you improvise, you can produce by accident. You produce things that you would never be able to create, that you would never think to create in a studio after the fact. There are those chance elements to it. And sometimes they're just extraordinary, what you produce. And I really wanted to capture that more and more. I thought if I could refine my process enough so I could capture these moments. I've come to realize, as I've been doing it more and more, and as I've got older, is that actually you can't be doing these incredible gems all the time. It just doesn't work. There's always that mundanity, and maybe it's a bit like that happiness, sadness thing, that you have to have the mundane to have the extraordinary. And so now I'm still doing performing live, and we're playing with bands. I play with the Melbourne Ska Orchestra. I have my own, I have a duo with a drummer friend, and we do a lot of kind of groove-based music for dancing, because I'm very interested in groove-based music. I played a lot of African music over the years. And I'm also working with Sally Ford, a singer, an older singer, and Patrick Cronin. And we have a trio called the Idiomatics, and we are doing sort of electronic sort of soundtrack music. It's a bit of a departure from what we did before, which was very Latin-based dance music. But I'm really enjoying it because it's very much in bringing together the sort of sound elements of my work with the live music performance side.
I was interested in it strikes me in music. I mean, I guess it's to do with bands and working with others in a band. There's a certain framework, there's a certain collaboration that needs to be done. There's a certain number of rules that need to be followed. And maybe in music, they're quite explicit and people learn them at college. And, you know, there's scales and there's timing and there's sections. And it feels like it's sort of a necessary or an evolved thing. People sort of know what they're doing. In bands, and I kind of think, okay, so that's one thing, and to improvise in that context, often it might be often it's, you know, one person who perhaps will take a turn improvising. There's that sort of form, but there are different forms of improvisation in music. I wonder, perhaps it might be interesting to talk about that, but also to compare that to your observations around improvising yourself in a sort of movement theatre context and observing perhaps how Penny and Caro navigate their collaboration.
It's interesting, and that's originally what drew me to their work, was that I could see these parallels with music, with improvisation in music, because they have scores. They work with these lots and lots and lots and lots of scores. The way they define them is different to music, but it's as rigorous as as jazz or as classical music. And in the same way that in music you move from classical, which is scored, everything is scored out, everything, all the notes are written for you, through kind of jazz, traditional jazz, where you have a structure, but there's a lot of improvisation involved in that, through to the really kind of free improvisation people who don't want to have any rules at all. But all of those disciplines all those things require a lot of rehearsal and practice. Free improvisation, you have to practice that really hard. You don't just step in and go, okay, there's no rules, so I'll just do what I want. Because it's all about listening. It's all about observing what others are doing. And when you see master, improvisers performing music, you can just feel this experience and this knowledge behind what they're doing. And in the same way, I think in in theatre, in movement, you go from the classical ballet, which is the most prescribed, everything's, set out, the director is God, everything else. Then you move through script-based stuff where things are a little bit more kind of improvised, until you get to the totally improvised works. And it's been a really interesting process since during COVID and after COVID, because Taxi and I have had this practice where we've tried to, we do this show every year called No Former Performer, which is a totally improvised show. And we've done it for 8 years now. And every year we do it, and it would always come at the end of the year, and everyone would be really tired, and we'd be, for the 2 weeks before, we'd really try and put lots of work in to try and kind of pull everything together and get it all going. And it always felt a very seat of the pants, very kind of, we were just kind of hanging in there. But for about 2 years during the COVID period, we, when there were breaks and so on, we tried to meet once a week, and we would to train, basically. And we would, Andrew Morris would zoom in from wherever he was. And he's been fantastic because he has really kind of given his time and working with us, giving us scores, developing, pushing us into different directions. And then we would work without him as well. And over those 2 years, because we were doing it regularly, I really started to feel that we were starting to gel. It was like rehearsing with a band. I felt this is like a trio. It's really coming together now. And in fact, 2 years ago was the first show that I did where I went out there and I went, I actually know what I'm doing now. I don't feel terrified. Because always before that, I would step out and I would just be absolutely terrified because I really wasn't quite sure what was going to happen or what I would do. Whereas now, I feel confident with the skills I have and the material I have that I can create this thing with these other people without any preparation, because we've worked really hard at the structures to do that, and that's where the work with them is really similar to music to me. We talk a lot about being a band. About a band, you take a solo now. How do we work as an ensemble, and do we work individually as soloists as well?
Well, the work that you've been doing with No Formal Performer and at TheatreWorks last year, there was a substantial season of improvised performance events that you did. These durational events, many people in the improv performance world might perform for, say, 10 minutes or fairly short periods of time, but with Taxi, you're performing maybe 40 minutes, maybe up to an hour. And I guess to sustain improvising for that duration, I'm wondering how much of that incorporates scores, how much of that incorporates decisions made to sort of foreground one person and background the other two, and play a bit like a band or an ensemble. And how much is free-flowing as the event sort of takes hold? How much of that is free-flowing as the hour or so progresses? I'd love to know more about how you find now, you're speaking of greater confidence in what you're doing, how you find you're able to sustain an hour together, and how much of that is structured and how much of that is emergent.
It's all emergent. That's the aim of that piece. That piece was always designed to be totally improvised. So really, the only structure we have is how we're going to start. So each night we'll go, how are we going to start tonight? Who's going to start? Does somebody want to do a solo? Do we all start together? What do we do? And apart from that, there is no structure. But as you improvise, the structure, it's that old saying, as you walk, the path unfolds, or whatever. So, this is what happens. And, at times, it's such an interesting thing because, at times when you that classic thing where you feel, oh, it's not working, or, why did I do that? Why did I do that sound or that thing? When of course you go, of course, whatever you do is right, because there's no structural score. So you're really following your nose, your instinct, and your intuition, and that's what's fantastic about it. And that's what really makes it very different each time. And it's very, you're always fighting those urges to fall back on the things that work, and that, your little tricks and whatever. But we do try to keep it as because really the whole idea of that was that we work really hard at these scores. We do lots of small scores. When we're training, we do 5 minutes, 10 minutes, all sorts of different combinations. And then we slowly build up. Sometimes we'll build up and do 20 and then 30 minutes, and then we'll try a 45 or whatever. So we're always playing around with different durations and different combinations. And Andrew, we call him the score bot. He gives us different scores to try. But when we get into doing that particular show, to the improvising, there are no scores. We just let all that go, and we're just totally, going on intuition, really.
It makes me think a little bit about, it's a bit similar to, a musician and his instrument. They spend a lot of time practicing scales. For some reason, I'm got in my mind the saxophone, but up and down, all of the technicalities around the instrument, maybe learning the pieces, memorizing the pieces, but then in the moment of playing, it's almost as if the instrument's not there. It's let go. And it's fantastic to hear you talk about the practice, because I think a lot of, I suspect that, well, including myself, improvisers and musicians, there's this sort of idea that if you can play an instrument, you should be able to play in any context. Especially if you're a great improviser, you should be able to play with anyone. And that if you can improvise and dance and do theatre, you'll be able to work in any kind of ensemble situation. But I've always felt that it's that gathering intimacy and connection and history, and those little signals, that the shared knowledge that actually creates the deepening and is where the magic lies, that sort of web. And you've reached a place where you can throw away any of the supports, because you have this trust and this shared knowing of the other, which is in between the three of you.
Yeah, look, it's very similar. It's the same in music. When you get a band together for the first time, the first few gigs you play, they're awkward. They're awkward. You have to play for quite a long time together before you sort of get this easy rapport with one another. Years often. But when you do get to that point, it's a fantastic place to get to. And just because you can do that, with a particular, group of people, it doesn't mean that you can just step into any context and that it's going to work. Sometimes it's really awkward and it doesn't work. And you're really working with different ideas or different ways of working, and it doesn't work. So this, it's chemistry. It's about chemistry, but it's also about, definitely about working at it, and, perseverance, about practice. And, it's very true what you said about that. The jazz saxophone player endlessly practices scales, over and for years, and practices hours and hours, practices scales. But then when they get onto the gig, they forget about all that and they just play. And, it comes out. I remember doing a workshop with an American jazz pianist called Hal Galper. And someone was asking him exactly, someone said, so, what you're showing us, these kind of little tricks and scales, he goes, how long does it take to learn this so you can play that? And he goes, I don't think about that. He says, all I know that is on a bandstand in Chicago in 10 years' time, I'm going to hear this stuff come out. So it's that long, the long term, you're in it for the long haul, really, if you really want to get into it deeply. So,
Michael, I'd like to ask you a little about the transition you spoke about before, of maybe a few years ago or many years ago, whilst improvising, that sort of, I maybe used the word fear or vulnerability. And when you're improvising, it was like quite a challenge to actually make a start. And then you sort of say, well, but now there's a bit of a shift that's happened and we find ourselves improvising. This is you in a taxi situation where there's much more, whether it be confidence or whether there's a type of solidity or a type of deep trust in the process. I'd love to know a little bit more, and I'm sure we all as improvisers know something about that transition or that transformation over time. That I'd love to know a little more about how it's happened for you and where it sort of places you now in your capacities as an improviser.
Yeah, look, yeah, it's an interesting. Look, all those things hold true. You know, it's about trusting in, you know, what you've learned. It's about having confidence in your skills and in what you do, and also you know, in the rapport of the group. All those things, which have really just come through work, really. And you know, I think about another improvised ensemble that I had, which was just a duo, which was with a synthesizer player, Anya Reynolds. We had a little duo for a while, and we just did improvised work together. And it always comes out of an intensive period of, you know, you have to put in, you know, those hours and the intense work to kind of get it to work. Often there's a bit of magic sometimes where there's a rapport and you go, yeah, this is working. But for me, it was really about putting in the time to really kind of explore and get in there. And also because my work is very technology based, there's always that thing. It took me a long time to refine my performance rig. I had lots of problems with it for many years with, you know, crashing software and things didn't work, and, you know, things I'd have to reboot in the middle of shows. And it was really, you know, I had lots of issues. I've got it to a pretty stable place now, but I realized that the things change so fast, and, you know, I'll be facing these same problems again in, you know, no time, really. For me now, I would, you know, I really want to take this sort of work, but into other areas now, not just working with physical performers. You know, I really would like to do much more work in other contexts. But once again, the whole issue is, you know, what outlets are there for this sort of thing? It's a pretty you know, specialized field. And, you know, the general public generally is not that interested in this sort of thing. So, you know, it's a bit like working in the reggae scene or something. It's a niche market. You know, you're working to a niche group of people. Luckily, Melbourne's big enough that, you know, there is actually a small audience for it. In places like, you know, the rest of Australia, who knows, in Darwin, there probably isn't, you know, a market for this sort of thing at all. But I don't really know at this point. So that, yeah, the transition really comes out of work, really, of just working hard at your skills and at what you're doing, and until you're confident that you can pull it off, really.
Earlier, you were talking about Melbourne State College and
oh yeah,
that ground and that almost, I kind of often think of that period as composting. The compost was laid in there, and there was a lot of sort of economic freedom as much as anything else. And so people had the option or the possibility to spend a lot of time together playing and working together, and it feels like that was a very lucky period, and that time that artists got to spend on their work, on their practice, has blossomed and is perhaps almost fading now, as it's been a long time since that possibility where people could really just dig in and practice and develop, spread out into the new.
Look, yeah, I think looking back now, you know, I can see it was we were an extremely fortunate time, really. You know, rents were cheap. You know, people could, you know, live very cheaply, and universities were much more kind of vibrant, creative, risk-taking places, unlike what they are now. But that's not to say that, there's still, people are still doing stuff. There's lots of young people doing great stuff. And there's interest in it. I guess, people just they'll find a way to make it work. It does worry me that I think a lot of people drop out of the arts because it's just economically too difficult to survive. And I've seen a few friends. I was recently an incredible musician has just dropped out of the music scene, and I met him recently at a gig, and I was really shocked to hear that he's working in finance now or something. So, I can't remember exactly what, but it was I was really shocked because he was like a stalwart on the music scene, an incredible player, great composer, but just gave up, just said, I can't do it anymore. I'm sick of not being supported, of having to justify myself every year for everything that I'm doing now. I'm not recognised. The people in the funding bodies keep changing, and there's people who don't know who I am anymore. And it's like, and it was pretty confronting to see that. And that is economic. And, Australia, unfortunately, I don't think is getting any better in its support of the arts, really.
Michael, I want to just spin off back a little again to your own practice with taxi. And just something I've observed over time as you're performing, how you more regularly now will move away from the rig. You will actually maybe even move to the edge of the stage or off the stage and re-enter, or you will actually integrate more through movement and meandering through the other performers more often. So it feels like that you're coming out from behind the rig more, you're entwining more with the, let's call it the movement action.
Yeah.
And it's been quite noticeable. And I do understand from maybe comments you've made in the past that maybe Andrew Morrish has been one of the sort of provocateurs around some of these prospects. But I'd love to hear your comment on that and what you're finding as you're expanding in that particular context.
Sure. That is one of the things that I've really want to do a lot more of. Look, it being involved physically, and like actually getting out from behind the rig. The rig can be a bit of a, safety barrier that you kind of retreat behind. It's my little world where I can be safe, and it's my world that I understand and know. And when I step out from behind it, then I'm in the scary movement world, where I'm definitely not as confident. I'm not super confident in that area. And I have in the past done a lot more of that stepping out, and I've I do speaking sometimes, and not so much movement. I'm not so confident in the movement thing, but definitely in the kind of speaking and, telling a story or whatever. I'm very much now into leaving the space and leaving, I'm very aware now of silence. Having silence is very, very important. So you don't want to fill the space with your sound constantly. You want to, make your offer. You either start or you join in, but then at some point you want to stop and leave, either leave the space or become a minor character in the space. And I have been playing with seeing how long I can leave for. And, I have thought of, just stepping out and stepping on a tram and going home, but that would be a pretty interesting thing to do. and of course, in the pressure of performance, if we're doing like a show, it's much harder to take those risks because these are things that I try often in when we're training rather than doing it in a performance, because the performance is much more high risk, and you're a bit more cautious perhaps than you might be than if you were just like training on a Tuesday afternoon. But yes, it's definitely something that I'm looking into more, which is actually being in much more a participant in the space, physically in the space, and also sonically, like it's telling a story, talking a lot more. So yeah, that's to come. That's that's what I'm exploring.
Michael, working with an audience who come to see improvisation, say something about your relationship to that audience as a performer, as a musician, versus an audience that might participate and dance and actually be very involved in what you're doing. So how is it for you to perform improvisationally to that particular niche audience group?
Well, because they're a niche group, they're coming along with an open mind, wanting to experience what you're doing. So, I mean, you've got a captive audience there. What I find really interesting is when I've invited people along who don't normally come to these sort of things. I invited, I had Pete Farnan, the rock musician, came to one of the shows. And he came up afterwards. He loved it. He just absolutely loved it. And he wouldn't normally go to things like that. Susie D, who works in theatre, she doesn't normally go to those things, but she really liked it too. So there's this. I think if what you're doing is strong and you're engaging the audience, and I think you feel that engagement with that, it's that flow state. When you get into that flow state, things really firing, you feel that energy coming off the audience and that engagement with the audience. I think that's a very magical state, and I think that's what you're always aiming for when you're performing, where you've got the flow with the performers, between the performers, but also that engagement with the audience as well, and that's the ultimate, really. That's the ultimate buzz, and that's why we do it, I suppose.
We'll finish up there,
sure,
Michael, on the notion of the ultimate buzz, and let's hope we all enjoy a 2024 of big buzz. Thanks so much for your time and for the inspiration. Inspirational to hear you.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak. That's great.
Yeah,
and I love what you're doing. All this podcast, fantastic. Michael, thanks for your time today. We've been waiting to have the opportunity to chat to you, and it's been such rich pickings. I think we've both been so enthused in preparation for today, but it's been rich pickings. Wonderful to spend time with you. Thank you. Great, thank you.